What's up, YouTube? Welcome to another episode of So You Want to Be a Code Reviewer. This is, I think, part 7. So I may be wrong, but I think it's part 7. Anyway, I thought I'd get this one also done. It's again a short one. We are talking primarily about, well, we're not talking about, I'm going to show you a very simple method, one method. All right. It has, you want to look at it from the perspective of method design, exception handling, all the stuff that I talk about in programming with intent. There's one method. There are, in my opinion, there are at least over a dozen issues, right? You want to look at seeing if you can find these problems. I'll, of course, explain to you the different problems and the why. You may or may not agree with me. I would do this in my own code, okay? So it's not like I'm being overly particular about somebody else's code. This is how I write code. This was a code review that I had received a couple of years ago. And I find these interesting because they're so simple. You take a look at the method here. That's it. All right. One method. Pause this. I'll change to the code screen again. Pause this, understand it, see if you can decipher the problems or figure out the problems. Make a note of those, and then we'll continue from here. Okay, so take a look. All right, ready? Okay, let's start. So from here, of course, the call site. First problem I have is this. So if this says get schema document, then this should be called schema document. If you're saying get X, then this should be X. Don't invent names. I can't tell you how often this is a problem. Now, it's not, you may or may not want to follow this idea of don't invent names. I think it's a really good thing to follow. Of course, because, I just find when we invent names, we can always invent the wrong names, right? So why invent a name? If something says get schema document, then it should be schema document. I mean, why would you say get schema document if that's not what you're getting back, right? So then call it schema document. However, what is this method actually returning? It's returning an XML schema. So if it's returning an XML schema, then this method should actually be called get XML schema from file, if that's what you want to add on here. So if this is called get XML schema from file, then the variable here should be called XML schema. So again, you're not inventing names. So already we have two issues. These are not, I think once you make it a habit, once you develop the keen eye for not only code reviews, the basic purpose of this series is not to try and make you a code reviewer. It's actually to try and make you a really good coder. Because you can't be a really good code reviewer if you don't know how to write code correctly. Because code reviews also imply design. So in some cases, I'll talk about that as well. There's a little bit of design here as well, method design. And so code reviewing is about a host of things. It's not just one thing. So if you want to be one, you got to be a damn good coder yourself. And that's what this video, the series is about. I do code reviews on a day-to-day basis. I find when I write my own code as well, I'm constantly criticizing it, fixing it up, cleaning it up. So you don't write code once, right? You write the code once, get it to work, and then you go back with a sort of a different hat on. And so, okay, now that this thing is working, let me refactor or clean it up. Right? That's before you send out a code review request, you need to first clean it up. I don't think people do the second part, that second step. I think most people just, it's done and out it goes, right? There's no second cursory look or cleanup process involved after you've written the code and got it to work. Maybe there's no time. Maybe you don't think you need to do it. But even the best of us can miss some of these things. All right. So then we look at this method signature here. It says application root folder and file name. And then over here is concatenating. All right. This method, obviously something called application root folder is either it's coming from a config file or the application discovers it at runtime, because if you're a web application, you need to know where's your physical root folder, right? It's not known to you at compile time. You can't configure that because you don't necessarily know how it's being deployed. So in web applications, you will dynamically at runtime discover your root path or root folder. this code, seeing that it's going so detailed into working with an actual file stream, is too low in level of abstraction. It's hardly got any abstractions at all. Right? So it's much lower in the totem pole. And so it should not be concerned with concatenating some application root folder and file name. How does it know? How does it know that this plus that is equal to the full path? Right? It can't know that. It's too low level. So the method signature here should not ask for two arguments. It should be asking for the one, which is the XML schema document file name or something. That should be the name of the parameter. And it should just be one. The call side, which is at a higher level abstraction, may be privy to that information, the application root folder, and what it means to the application and the file name, and can do the combine path or combine or whatever to get the file path name. Okay, so that's already 3 down. What was it? 1, 2, and 3. All right, then coming here, stream. What the heck is a stream? This is obviously a file stream, returning a file stream. Call it a file stream. Why invent names again? Don't invent names. I don't know why this is such a hard thing to do. I think people like short names that have no meaning necessarily, don't add any value to even having a name, Like request will be called REQ. Like, okay, if we don't need it, why invent a name for it? Just leave it be, right? Just let it be the way it is. Give it the name of the type. So here it should be called file stream rather than stream. Now there's a using block and a try catch block. Now a using statement at compile time gets lowered. If you remember my C# loading video, I'll put a link to it over here, C# loading. If you don't know what that is, please take a look at that. It's a very interesting and important idea as a C# programmer to understand. We don't need to understand the depths of it. Conceptually, if you understand it, you'd be a little better programmer, coder. The using statement lowers down to a try finally, right? So there's a try finally and there's a try catch nested inside the try finally. This is not how you want to write code. So you don't write code such that there's a using and then that's a try finally and a try catch nested. So rather than do that, you should use try catch finally, the one statement at the one level, try catch finally. So anytime you find yourself using multiple usings, or you have a try catch inside of a using, don't use the using. Now, I'm not saying don't use the using. I'm saying use a try catch finally, and then in the finally, you can dispose of whatever you were doing in the using part. That's why it's important to understand that using translates to a try finally, so that you understand in my case, what I'm recommending, but also you understand by yourselves that you can change the code over to being a try catch finally, which is the same thing as doing a using, but it's better than doing a using within a try catch nested inside of a using. There are, besides the complexity in the way the code looks, there is also a minor performance issue by having nested try catches or try finallys. So just have it as one statement, try catch finally. All right, so that's that. This local variable here, if that's called XML schema, why are we inventing names? Call that an XML schema. So that's that. I hope you guys caught that. Did you guys catch that? That's like one of those simple ones, right? It's almost you can see it together. XML schema. Okay, why is it called schema when this type is called XML schema? Just call it XML schema. This line here, what's the null? This is a problem, not necessarily like a language issue. The language actually provides you with a solution that I'm going to recommend. But as a programmer, do you not wonder when you see code like that, what's null? Like what is the parameter that you're sending in as a null? Or even if it's like an empty string, like what's the empty string? Like what's the parameter that is being set to an empty string? Isn't it like, aren't you curious to know that? When you program with intent, you're showing me your intent. You're not forcing me to have to guess and debug and use the ID and all. I mean, you just show me the code and I should be able to understand it. So if you provide a null as a parameter value or an empty string as a parameter value, especially when well, it doesn't even matter. I was going to say, especially if there are more than one string, it doesn't matter. If you're going to give me an argument that doesn't have a name, right? So if a parameter doesn't have a name and you're giving me directly a null, then I don't know what the parameter is. if you had a local variable that had a similar name to the parameter type, and then that was null, that's one thing I can understand that. But just by itself, you pass in a null or an empty string, I don't know what that is. So always use the feature in C#. I think they introduced in like 5 or 6 called named arguments or named parameters. So use that. So over here, you should be able to use, first of all, you see what it is. It says validation event handler. So you should be able to use the validation event handler named parameter here. I think in C#7, they also made an improvement where you can randomly choose when you want to use them or not. In other words, I think in the previous version, version 6, when they introduced it, it was like, once you start using name parameters, all the remaining type of parameters had to be also named. You can pick and choose the ones you wanted to be named. Now they're saying you can pick and choose the ones you want to be named. Maybe I'm wrong, I'm going to forget, but it's not coming the way anymore. So at least the way I see it is now it works very much like how I would expect it. So here I would say use name parameters. This stream, of course, it will be called file stream. So you would know that that's a file stream, but what the heck is a null? What's the null going in? And apparently it's the validation handler. Is it? Event handler, yeah, because the schema document. So it would file an event as it's validating the document if there's an error. So you can intercept that error, kind of do your own thing if you want it and return it with your message, if you will. The best way to do exception handling is to not handle them. The best way to do exception handling is to not handle exceptions. Honestly, that's the best way to do it. If you don't understand exception handling, don't bother doing a try catch. You are causing a lot more pain by doing a try catch each time if you don't understand what the implications of that are. Leave it alone. Secondly, you cannot claim to know what to do in every possible scenario. In this case, it's saying, I'm going to catch an exception. Really? You're telling me that you know what to do, and no matter what the scenario is, you know exactly what to do. And on top of that, you're saying, you're going to throw this, now because the name here, my application name is going to be something else. I've just named it my application name here, schema exception. So no matter what the exception here is, you're going to say, I'm going to throw a schema exception. This is going to cause a lot of trouble in production. You're going to be left scratching your head for days, if not, weeks, trying to figure out what's going on. There's another problem here with the same line. Again, the best way to handle exceptions is to not handle them. It's the best way. Now, if you are catching an exception, you just need to know what to do. Otherwise, you're going to make it a whole lot worse. Even if you know what you're doing, the best way to handle exceptions is to not handle them. And I'll explain that a little later, the statement in the full form. There's a video of mine here called Programming to Exceptions. Yeah, meaning I'll put a link to it here. Please take a look at that. All right. This is extremely dangerous. This is not going to be the way. I would never accept this. Especially, again, at the level at which this code is. A try catch with catching of an exception is only acceptable in the outermost block of your application, the entry point of an application. It's not acceptable anywhere else. Anywhere else, you either don't catch exceptions, which is my preference. And in this case, I'll explain to you why I'm okay with exceptions. But if you are catching exceptions somewhere inside your system, not at the entry point, but somewhere deep. And this thing is so deep in the system, in terms of it's such a low-level abstraction that you can't do a try catch. You just can't. There is a reason for why this exception is there, or I'm saying the exception is okay. Catching this exception is okay, but the way you're catching not you, the type exception, the base class is not okay. Catch specific exceptions. Always catch specific exceptions. Even if you need to catch 2, 3 specific exceptions, do that. It far outweighs the benefits of the pros and cons. Catching an exception could get you into trouble because you're throwing a very specific exception here. I don't mean getting you into trouble in the sense of something's going to go wrong. You're just going to have a hard time finding out what's actually happening. because your exception type is a specific type. It's saying it's a schema validation issue, right? Or schema exception, when it's probably not. What if you can't find the file? That's not a schema issue. What if there was an exception trying to access the file? That's not a schema issue, right? There could be many kinds of problems. There could be all kinds of issues. Out of memory will also come in here. So nobody's saying that out of memory is a schema validation issue or a schema issue. It's not. So don't claim to know what to do for every possible exception. That's just too dangerous. It's too presumptuous of you. So that catch block with an exception type is only allowed or acceptable, at least in my book, in my world, at the entry point of a system. Because so at that point, you're essentially translating a C# exception to a SOAP exception or a GPRS system exception or a HTTP exception or something else. Right? You're not catching exception, claiming I know exactly what to do in this scenario. You're catching all exceptions so that you can translate that. So that's the only time it's acceptable. So even then, you're catching exception to translate that exception to something else, another form, another protocol. You're not claiming to know what to do in that case of that exception. Right? Over here you are. All right. The other problem with this is you're losing the original exception. All exceptions, yours and in .NET as well, all .NET exceptions do have a second argument called the inner exception. As you can see here, the inner exception. Right? You can't not use that. You must use. So basically, I'm saying you should do that. Always pass the inner exception, even if you're throwing your own exception. There's never an exception to not. There's never an exception to not using exceptions. There's never an excuse or a reason, never a good reason to not pass in the original exception as the inner exception. Never. You can never convince me that that's a good case, a good scenario ever. It's just not possible. Always use the inner exception or provide the inner exception as the original exception if you are throwing an exception in a cache block. Right? Always don't lose that exception. Always use that as the inner exception, right? Like that as the second argument. All right. Okay. So that two problems right there. One for the fact that you're catching an exception, and the other you're not sending in the original exception as the inner. When I see code like this, first of all, my brain can't understand it. Like, what are you trying to tell me exactly? You got a try catch, yet you're going to get past the catch to do something. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, that's a very, very rare scenario. In my books, it's a very, very rare scenario. You're going to have to justify to me that even makes sense to you. I don't even understand what that code is doing at this point. And I'm, of course, being a bit facetious here. This is just bad code. This is code written by someone that does not understand exceptions. Period. Because to have code after a catch block, as I said, it's a rare occurrence. It's not a common thing. It happens maybe once in every 5 systems, maybe once in every system at most, right? It's such a rare case. So this should never be there. What are you trying to tell me? That I'm going to do that. If there's an exception, I'm going to do this, else I'm going to do that. Or not, if there's no exception. So why isn't this not inside the try catch? Are you saying that this method would never throw an exception? Like, I don't understand the logic here. What's the logic? What's the reasoning for this to be outside the try block? Does that make sense? Okay. I'm not saying that could never be the case, but it's a very, very rare case. So anytime you see that, or every time you write code like that, you need to question it. Why am I writing this piece of code or these 2 lines of code or the rest of the code outside the catch block? Why is it not in the try block? I mean, if you're trying to catch exceptions, then might as well just do everything, all the code in the try block, right? What's the point of saying I'm going to just do 1 line in the try block and then the rest of it I'm going to do outside the try block? Doesn't make sense. So that's the other problem. The third issue here is you are simply, I'm sorry, I keep saying you. Okay, it's not you, but whoever wrote this code. This message is what the message was here. So let's say it's out of memory, right? Okay, then I don't understand. What is the purpose of translating it to some specialized exception if all you're going to do is you're going to repeat the same message again. That doesn't make sense at all. Why would you do that? Why do you think, why is this even acceptable? Why am I saying this is okay, but that's not? Let's understand that part. So this is going back to the programming to exceptions. That's the video. If you want a much deeper understanding of that, please take a look at that video and I put a link to up here. Essentially, when you throw an exception, or the reason you would do this sort of thing, and this again happens typically deep in the guts of your system. You're working with your database or maybe your file system or something, and you have an exception. You don't want file system exceptions or database related exceptions, DB exceptions, to leak out of your system. That's in many ways allowing your implementation to leak out of the system. Now people know that there's a database, and a SQL server or whatever the case may be. Right? It's not you're not trying to keep a secret, but maybe classes upstream and certainly users of your application don't necessarily know that you're using a database. How would they know that? I mean, like, is it obvious all the time that you're using a database? I mean, maybe I'm using a file system instead of a database. So when I say, when you say get customer, I'm using a file system and it says file not found. I'm thinking like, huh? What's the file got to do with it? I asked you for a customer, not a file, right? That implementation could be confusing, but also it's not useful to the user, right? It doesn't really matter. If you can't find the file, really, I don't care to know that you couldn't find a file. I asked for a customer. You should be telling me, can't find the customer. Another scenario would be key violation in a database, right? If you might have an index, let's say I've got for my users, the email address has to be unique. And so if I were to create another user by the same email address, the database is going to say, key violation or something, right? What is a key violation? Do you think your users care to know what a key violation is? No, of course not. So in that case, you would catch the exception and translate that exception. So you would catch that specific exception. No, SQL, so there's no specific exception. You'll have to look at the type of exception and then the message to make sure it says key violation. And in that scenario, you would say, okay, then throw one of my business exceptions that says, user already exists or duplicate user or whatever the business exception is. And your message is going to include your message, not key violation, right? So when you throw an exception, your intention should be always, again, I need to find another word. I keep saying there are no exceptions to the rule. Without exception, right? Each time you throw an exception, your aim is to throw the correct type of exception because the type matters, right? That will be in your log files or however you do your logging. It's going to be there. That name of the exception should already tell you the problem. Right? Type of exception should already tell you the type of problem. You shouldn't have to guess that. You might want to know details. What customer, what email address is duplicate, right? But you know that this is a duplicate customer or username or what are the cases in your system. That exception type has to be specific. The message should clearly indicate the problem and the possible solutions, meaning you're not just giving some vague idea of the problem, you're giving the real problem and the possible solutions, which means you need to, in this particular case, specify that, hey, your email address, blah, 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 already pre-exists. Right? You can't just say duplicate user and say, that's it. That's not going to help. Right? Key violation, okay, like in this table, who cares, right? As someone throwing an exception out of choice, in the case like this, where you're translating an exception, it is your responsibility to provide much more information than e.message, which would probably say, I don't know what, file not found. You still don't know what file. Right? What's the point of saying file not found? You don't know what the file is. So that's the other problem with this exception part is the message has to be very clear. Right? You need to provide proper indication of the problem and one or more potential solutions, if possible, to fix the problem. Right? So if the file is not found, maybe you say the path is not incorrect. This is the path. That's the file name. One of them is not correct. So given all of that, even here, there could be some issues you could question over here in this method, even though there's no implementation. I'm just looking at the signature. Add data element to schema if not present. So there's a schema and you want to add the data element to it, which means you send some schema document here. It goes back with the modified schema. And this is not clear Because these are reference types. Again, so this is that whole thing. I have this issue with taking advantage of the fact that something is a reference type and then magic happens, right? It came into your system, you modified it, and it didn't return anything, this method. So you don't know it made a change. But somehow the caller is supposed to be aware that, hey, when I send this particular reference type to this method, not the 15 other methods, but to this method, it's going to modify it. I don't like that. So either use the ref modifier in the arguments or parameters, or return this type. Now, I don't like refs. There's a C# design guideline, even though the C# language does have very specific ways in which they use ref, like for the try XXX methods. And then in the newer C# 7 and 8, they have the ref out parameters and so many other areas where they use the ref modifier for local variables and return types and all that. So that's okay. I'm talking about the ref as arguments. Since that was the guideline at that time was saying don't use ref and out for input arguments. They didn't know they were going to change the language, 5 years later or 10 years later to be inclusive of ref outs and ref locals. So yeah, so don't do that. So what I would suggest here is instead of doing this like this, I would change this void returning method to another returning XML schema. You make the modification, return it. It's very easy or clear on the call site that when you call this method, it's going to return, which means it's going to do some modification. Now, you don't need to know whether it's the same instance or not, right? It could be, maybe it's not. You don't need to know. All you need to know is when you get that return type, that's modified. So if that's the modified version, that's the reference you want to maintain and move forward with, not the previous one, even though they may be the same reference. So let's look at the modified. So I've listed out all the stuff here. I don't know if I'm not going to make this code available, but as you can see, there's at least 13 problems here. And then I give a whole dialogue on exception handling. You can pause the screen in case you want to read all the details of that to the extent possible. Okay, so I've implemented some of the exceptions. I call this method get XML schema from file. So that's called XML schema. This takes only one argument, XML schema file. And that's just used directly over here. This argument, this variable is called file stream. This one's called XML schema. I'm using a try catch finally, because you can see there are 3 catches here. And then finally, how do you know how many to have? Well, just look at the stuff you know to handle. You can get a file IO exception in case the file is not found. This should probably be the file not found. So this is XML schema document was not found. This one says XML schema document found in the path blah blah is not valid. Right? In case the document is not valid, the schema document itself is not valid. And if there was a schema exception, then you throw that exception. Anything else, you don't know what to do. So you're not claiming to handle exception, but you are claiming to handle these 3 kinds of exceptions, and you're translating that to your business exceptions with proper messages to indicate the problem and the possible solutions. And then finally, you close the file stream if it's not null. So there's a try catch finally, and then that's the code. And here, this code is inside of the try block rather than after the try catch finally block. All right, so that's the original method. One simple method, pretty benign looking. Wouldn't have imagined it has all these problems to it. 12, 13, maybe 14 issues with this simple method. I hope this was fun. I hope this was surprising to you, and maybe you agree or don't agree with some of the issues I've called out. Some of them are bugs in my mind, like all the exception, the way the exception handling was done. All of the exception related things that are in my mind, all bugs, because that's going to cause a lot of trouble. It's working correctly, but when it goes wrong, it's going to throw you off, on a loop, on a tangent. Your life is going to be miserable. So for me, that I would consider that to be a bug. The others are, what I call just, guidelines, coding standards, whatever. You may or may not agree with them. This is what I do. So let me know whether you agree with some of these or all of these things or not. And if not, why not? And we can have a dialogue. I'll be happy to try and understand your point of view. And of course, certainly explain in case I've not explained this in this video. I can point you to some other videos where I have explained that with the points of view. So, all right. So I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. I hope you learned a few things. If you have, please give me a thumbs up. And I shall see you next time.